Hello everybody, my presentation is about the translation problems and solutions. As you already know, I'm working with literary translation and the specific problems involved in the process. This presentation is based on the fourth chapter of the book Translation in Practice by Jill Paul. In general terms, it discusses some general problems that translators may face when they are translating literary works, and is intended to provide some suitable solutions for such types of problems. So, let's start with this outline of my presentation. First, we have some basic concepts that I use to introduce the topic of literary translation and its main issues. Then I explain in detail some of the most outstanding problems proposed by Jill Paul. There, some examples are used to illustrate the way those difficulties can be overcome. The problems covered are titles, stylized language, regional dialects, strong language, colloquialisms, humor, untranslatable words, and culture-specific references. In the end, I have the references of this presentation. Basic concepts. First of all, it has to be clear that every book is different and presents its own problems. For this reason, translators of literary fiction are in charge of making critical decisions when it comes to produce the best possible translation. It is believed that sometimes it's more important to create a translation that can evoke the spirit and particular energy of the original rather than only making a translation faithful to the original. Usually, this is the main concern of a translator, because he may think that taking those liberties can be considered as corruption. So, steering away from a literal word-for-word translation will not be a good idea. However, the new work, the translated work, is an interpretation of the original, and because of this, the translation should not preserve literal words and phrases for preservation's sake. On the contrary, translators are encouraged to use their own creative writing skills to adapt the original. What we must know is that translators should be willing to take risks in order to make sure that the readers of the translation have the opportunity to access the work of the writer in the best possible way, something that cannot be achieved with a word-for-word translation, because it will not stimulate the reader's interest. Many people think that the translation of literary works is one of the highest forms of rendition, because it is more than the simple translation of texts, what is related to lexis and syntax. A literary translator must have the skills to translate feelings, cultural nuances, humor, and other elements of a piece of work. Now that we know that the translation is a challenging activity, there must be some specific difficulties that come out throughout the translation process, due to the fact that every language portrays the world in different ways. According to Sachin Khedkar, in the field of literary translation, the central problem is that of finding target language equivalents for features of the original, like style, genre, figurative language, historical stylistic dimensions, polyvalence, connotations as well as denotations, cultural items, and culture-specific concepts and values. So, what are the main problems in these areas? And what can we do in order to solve those problems? Well, now we're going to see in detail some of the problems and solutions proposed by Jill Paul. The first problem is related to the translation of titles. The author says that in most of the cases, a literal translation of the title will often be ineffective to get the attention of the prospective audience. Actually, the title is a commercial decision, and sometimes a complete change is required to make a book saleable and more attractive for readers. For this reason, decisions have to be made based on the words that better reflect the content of the book. Here we have some examples where the translation of the title was crucial. First, we have the case of Sandra Smith, the translator of the book Suite Française, who decided to leave the title in French despite the fact that she was worried about the acceptance in the American market. However, the book was a bestseller in the UK and the US in 2007. On the other hand, we have the case of the Italian writer Primo Levi, who did not agree with changes made to the titles of his books. For example, the title "If This Is a Man" was an integral part of the book. Nevertheless, it was changed in the American edition to "Escape from Auschwitz," a title that he considered as totally inappropriate and vulgar. In addition, in other of his books, the Italian title "La Chiave a Stella" was published in the US as "The Monkey's Wrench." However, this decision was wrong because the title refers to a tool with certain shape, and the apostrophe changes its sense. Although this is not always the case, Gilles-Paul says that relying on a literal translation for a title is a common mistake because the translator may select a misleading title which can affect the reader's reaction. Generally speaking, literary translators are encouraged to be creative when it comes to decide on the best title for a book. And this is the case of the book The Prince of Thorns, which belongs to the trilogy from which I took the third book for my project. Here, the translator decided to translate the title as El Príncipe del Mal instead of El Príncipe de los Espinos. The next problem is the stylized language. Translating a text can present a problem if the text was written in a particular style a long time ago. However, contemporary authors also write with styles that can be problematic. Here, the problem is if the translator decides to update the text to refresh it and make it accessible, thereby losing distinctive use of vocabulary and other characteristics of the original text. As the author says, no one would expect to read Shakespeare in modern English, because it would lose its beauty. For this reason, Gilles-Paul suggests these tips. If the author is alive, his help will be decisive, because authors can help the translator to have a better understanding of their works, and even they can help the translator to make good decisions for the new work. Unfortunately, translators may not always have this option, and they need to use their artistic abilities to recreate a new style that might be able to have the same effect on the readership. In older works, translators are often required to source and examine original material and critics in both languages, in order to establish the correct mood, tone, and style. Sometimes, certain feeling can influence the style of a text. However, that system may not work in the new language, and it may look like the translation is bad. For this reason, the translator can try to convey that feeling by different means, like subtly referring to it, for instance, or moving direct dialogue into indirect. But sometimes you can simply leave the passage out. As Gilles-Paul says, something will have been lost, but the important thing is that the translation should not call the attention to itself, because it can spoil the reader's experience of the book. Regional dialects. The group of characteristics of foreign languages is part of what makes them interesting, and it can be a mistake to simplify them completely. Gilles-Paul says that there must be an essence of something different, and this is what makes works unique. In this example, Hannah Al-Shaikh, a Lebanese writer, wanted to maintain the idiom of the original language in her work. For this reason, she used the direct translation of a phrase from a southern dialect of Arabic. This translation is, "I thought she must be imagining that a hyena had pissed on our leg." In Arabic, this phrase means to hypnotize or capture. However, it is difficult for the reader to deduce that idea. As a consequence, in English, the translator had to add, "I thought she must be imagining that a hyena had pissed on our leg and stolen us away to its lair." In this case, the idiom needs a little explanation for the readers. As the author says, in the case of idioms, one can't be entirely faithful. Sometimes one needs to explain it as well. Clearly, living in Too many unknown cultural references will make your translation less attractive, losing readers, but sometimes the translator needs to provide the necessary explanations. Now we have strong language. Jean-Paul explains that bad words are integral to a book, and because of this, they should always remain in the translation. In many cases, translators tend to clean up the strong language because they are not comfortable with it, even though the writer wrote those words with a purpose. The problem is that the translator must be careful, seeing that it is difficult to make a language accessible and relevant without offending more delicate sensibilities. Because in some cultures, swearing is a more common activity, whereas, for example, in English-speaking countries, bad language is considered as less acceptable. Another problem, too, is the wealth of bad words in some languages, which cannot be matched by equivalents in other cultures. In this example, Robert Chandler, regarding the translation from Russian into English of the railway, says, "Curses and swear words present a particular problem for translators, because of two reasons. First, the lexicon in his culture is limited, and second, a literal translation of the bad words from Russian would sound inadequate." He suggests simplifying those words and even up the situation by adding our own perception of the essence of the bad words in the other culture. Now let's see some colloquialisms. In this area, the most important issue with slang is the selection of the appropriate terms. The translator should ask himself if the slang he has chosen will remain current. This is important because with some translations you can almost identify the year or the month in which it must have been translated, especially when it comes to teenage slang. For this reason, Jean-Paul explains that in this area it can be a question of getting exactly the right translator for the job. He defines the profile of a translator as someone who must have a good working knowledge of colloquialisms, dialect and slang in the native country, who can get across their meaning and help to come up with equivalents that are appropriate, equivalents that can survive throughout time and that can be perceived as natural by the readers. In other words, translators must be sensitive to the cultural and colloquial differences in different countries. Even teamwork would be necessary to overcome any difficulty. Humor. Just as slang often fails to translate, so humor can present a problem for translators. Jean-Paul presents the main problems. First, some elements that are funny in another language cannot be perceived like that in the target culture. Sometimes explanations reduce any humor of a text. Equivalents may simply be out of context with the book itself, and might be perceived as nonsensical. According to Robert Chandler, humor tends to be what gets lost most easily in translation. If we want a joke to survive into another language, its context can no longer be taken for granted. It needs to be adjusted. For this reason, the translator is allowed to depart from the literal meaning quite often. Martin Riker thinks that the most successful translation of jokes are more likely to be replacements than literal translations. Replacing jokes from the original language with a comparable joke in the new one. He thinks that what is translated is humor more than jokes per se. Other difficult aspects to translate are the plays on words which are specific to their original language. The translator has to use his abilities in order to find an equivalent or create a new play to retain the characteristics of the original. In such cases, the translator has to decide which is more important for the translation, the literal sense of the phrase or its effect. We should bear in mind that not every single thing in the original is translatable. Sometimes translators omit jokes that need too much explanation, and they try to find a way to compensate it. As in the previous case, teamwork would be necessary to overcome any difficulty. Untranslatable words and culture-specific references. As you know, the first problem is that some words cannot be translated. For this reason, Ross Schwartz suggests to leave them in the text as they are. There are two options in order to avoid interrupting the flow of the text with lengthy descriptions and explanations. You can provide the reader with a glossary, for example, with the explanation of geographical issues or cultural references. Or you could also provide a map that will be worthy for readers. This author says that eliminating traces of foreignness completely from the text is not a good idea at all. Additionally, Ewan Cameron says that translators need to rely on footnotes to some extent in order to convey cultural anomalies. He says that may be other options, but in the end, footnotes may be the only option to avoid lengthy discourses interrupting the flow of the text. In terms of culture-specific references, it is clear that when source and target language belong to different cultural groups, the first problem faced by the translator is finding terms in his own language that express the highest level of faithfulness possible to the meaning of certain words. For example, there are some words that are related to typical fabrics, cookery specialties, or job. They represent specific culture, and translators should be very careful in translating such words because its readers may not know about these elements. The solution proposed by Martin Riker is to make such references familiar to the reader using some tricks that can contextualize the terms without altering the experience with the book. First, you have to assume the position of the reader and should consider the overall experience of reading the original and how best to approximate that experience for the reader. For example, you can add an explanatory phrase, or you can clarify the location of a town or the background of a cultural practice. Here we have two specific examples. It may happen that a reader gets stuck when he finds the word croque monsieur in the text. The solution is easy. You can add a short description for it. For example, the cheese oozed over the salty ham of his croque monsieur sandwich. There is no reason why general explanations cannot be offered from time to time. In the next example, you can substitute the Moroccan word ras al hanout for a vaguer description like a fragrant spice mix. Well, these were the problems and easy solutions proposed by Gilles Paul in his book Translation in Practice, and these are the references. In the end, we should remember that every book is different, and the previous suggestions are just some ideas the author provides in order to find appropriate equivalents for many problematic terms that literary translators find in the process.